Can anybody see that?
Yep, I can see it.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I'm muting now.
Everybody's good to
Okay,
go.
everyone's muted. That'll be good.
Right. So I'm going to talk about the far side of the moon, because we all know what the near side is. And is it yet full of just aliens, or is there something else going on there? So let's get into it. If I can find the right buttons. Oh, and did somebody say cake? I can't remember, but I thought I'd introduce a bit of cake just in case. So there's the cake for today. So the near side of the moon. I hope everybody has seen the near side of the moon. Somebody wave if they haven't never seen the near side of the moon. Very good. So the near side of the moon, we're all very familiar with, because that's the only side we get to see, as the moon is locked in position, and that's the face that sees it facing us. And we've even been there and touched it. These are the landing points of the Apollo astronauts. You can see there various sites across the moon, all on the near side though. So we've not had any Apollo landings on the far side of the moon. So that's always been a little bit of a mystery. If you've got something that's internally hidden, people are going to start making up stories and wonder what's going on there. So this lets the conspiracy theorists have a wild ride of possibilities of what might be going on the far side of the moon. And we've had various newspapers wonder about this over the times. This is the Daily Mirror from 2016. They say that a new photograph has shown a giant alien castle found on the moon by UFO experts. I don't know what a UFO expert is, but they probably wear anoraks. And this is the alien castle that you can clearly see in full view on the near side of the moon, I have to say. This is a blow up of it. There we can see clearly what is an alien castle all monitoring us. Now, if some of you are a bit older, you might remember a fine journalistic establishment called the Sunday Sport. And they had all sorts of wild and wacky stories, including this one that they suggested that it was a World War II bomber that was found on the moon. They had quite a few of things in the same vein. This is the World War II bomber found on the moon. You might notice with all these pictures that it's always right at the limit of resolution almost, that you can't quite be sure whether this is a World War II bomber or just something a little hazy. But that didn't let them, that was no problem for them. They had the technology, they zoomed in and enhanced that. And here we can see a picture of it. Clearly, World War II bomber, American one. I think it's probably a B-17, I'm not really sure. But it's in a very large crater. So it probably has a wingspan of several kilometers there. So we've had this series of things over the years that the moon is a good hiding place for all sorts of things, and particularly the far side, because we never get to see it. The Sunday Sport did have to roll back somewhat, and they then had another headline that says, oh, the World War II bomber that was found on the moon has now vanished. So they went on to other things, such as a London double-decker bus found at the South Pole and Elvis on Mars. So all sorts of possibilities they have there. There was even a film done by the Transformers, which focused on the dark side of the moon. I haven't seen it, so I don't know what's going on there. And even back many, many years, back in the 1800s, there was even a series of articles run by the New York Sun, in which they claimed that was a brand new telescope designed by Sir John Herschel, and he could see all sorts of fine detail on the moon that we'd missed up till now. Unfortunately, he was in the southern hemisphere in South Africa at the time, photographing the southern sky, so he was completely unaware of this. But they had some wonderful pictures that showed life on the moon, ran for about a week or so. I think he was rather bemused when he actually found out some of the details about this. And of course, if you lived through the 70s and 80s, this is one of the albums you had to have, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. And it does end with the final bit of the last track that it says there is no dark side of the moon, really. As a matter of fact, it's all dark. Jerry O'Driscoll, the doorman at Abbey Road Studios, intoned those words. So, just to move a little from the wild speculation to a little bit of hard science. So the formation of the moon, our best option at the moment is that it starts with a bang, that a planetoid about the size of Mars crashes into the early Earth about 4 and a bit billion years ago, chips off a whole load of stuff that swirls around. We may even have had rings around the Earth for a little while. You can perhaps see there that it has to hit at just the right angle. If it hits too full on, then it shatters the Earth into sort of a million pieces and we have nowhere to live. And if it hits at too shallow an angle, it just bounces off into outer space. But if it has this just glancing blow, then that's how they think the moon was formed. And that explains why a lot of the moon rocks are very similar to the Earth rocks, because they were basically made all from the same thing. The next issue is, why does the moon always face one way? And this is what's called tidal locking, that the moon is locked to always face one way, well, not to one way, but always to face directly at the Earth. And this is caused by tidal friction. So you're probably aware that the moon raises tides on the Earth. So we get tides on the Earth twice a day, once when the moon is facing it over here, and once for a sort of equal and opposite reaction at the other side of that. So there's a big wall of water that moves around the Earth as it rotates, dragged up there by the moon. Now the Earth does a similar thing to the moon, and it drags on the moon, but not being any water of any significant quantity on the moon, there is no sort of tidal waves that move across the moon. But nonetheless, there is a raising of the rocks, that the rocks nearest to the Earth are raised slightly more than the rocks further away. And I've showed it rather distorted here. So there's this sort of lump that follows the Earth around. And in the early days, as it span, you get these effects. As the moon tried to rotate, this sort of lumpy bit would rotate away and be pulled on very slightly by the Earth. And this would start to slow it down. And over a few million years, this indeed did slow the rotation of the moon down until it only presents one face to the Earth. Now, it doesn't mean it's not spinning at all. I hope you can see this, but as it goes round there, you can actually see it does rotate once for every revolution around the Earth. So the moon is still spinning, but it's now spinning synchronously as it goes round, so that it always presents the same face. But the moon's orbit isn't quite circular. It's very faintly elliptical. So you get to see a little bit more, because at some points in its orbit, it has to move a little faster just to keep up to fit into the ellipse. So it twists a little bit, and you can see a little bit more of the moon's surface than just the sort of 50% of it. And the fact that it's spinning slightly off axis also helps. So if you watch it over a period of days, you get this effect called libration, which I hope this animation comes out okay over Zoom. So you can see there, it sort of wobbles around, and you can see right on the edge, craters come into view and go out of view just a little bit. So over a 28-day period, which is its orbital period, more or less, you can see about 60% of the moon. So we can see a little bit more than that. We can have a peek around the edge, and we can actually see there are no aliens just right on the very edge of that. But still, the far side is completely hidden to us. And it would take getting into the space age before we were able to actually see what was beyond there. And up to that point, the conspiracy theorists could have a field day. They could say it was full of aliens, and nobody could say any different because we couldn't see. So getting to the space age, it was a bit tricky to actually see anything of interest behind the moon because of just basic geology, really. So we had the Earth and the moon, and if you're going to land on the far side of the moon, you've got a large moon-shaped object sitting between you and the Earth. So you can't really communicate through all this solid rock. Radio waves don't go through rock. So you're a bit stuck there that the radio waves could get there, but not penetrate through the moon and get to the probe or whatever it is on the other side of that. So you can't really communicate with it. Now, there's a couple of things you could do. You could put a satellite somewhere in the vicinity and bounce the signals off it. This was definitely considered at some points. Trouble with this is, it's where do you put the satellite? There are a couple of logical places maybe. One place is right out here, then you can sort of send the signal past the moon and then bounce it off the satellite and then down to the lander on the moon. And that would work, except if you put a satellite there, right out there, you're actually in orbit around the Earth at that point, because it's far enough away to avoid the moon's gravity. So it doesn't stay there. It meanders off on its own, going around the Earth. It goes at a different speed to the moon. It actually goes slower as you move further out. So the moon would zip away and leave this satellite no longer really in communication. So it's okay for very brief periods of time, but not a good solution long term. The other way is to put the satellite much closer to the moon. And in this case, you're now, it won't just hang there in the sky, but it will orbit around the moon. But this way you only get to see, you either get to see the Earth or the lander, but not really both at the same time, or at least it's pretty difficult, and only a few seconds can you communicate directly. Otherwise you have to store up what it said and transmit it to the Earth when you're in a better position. There is, however, one lucky place that you can put it where you can get around both of these problems. And this is at one of these points called L2, which is shown here. These are Lagrange points, named after French mathematician Lagrange. And these are places where the moon and the Earth's gravity sort of cancel each other out. So L1 is the most obvious because there you're sort of being pulled by the moon one direction and pulled by the Earth in the other direction. So when you're at L1 here, it's sort of gravity cancels out almost, and if you put something there, it will pretty much stay there, more or less. Much better for talking to the far side is this L2 position. So it's quite a way out, but if you put a satellite there, it again will stay there and it won't drift off. And there is enough room to sort of bend around the moon and talk to it. So that's the favored position for talking to stuff on the far side of the moon. Although you can obviously do it with a satellite in orbit around the moon if you're prepared to just wait a little while. There's another three Lagrange points, L4 and L5, and these are both in the moon's orbit and they sort of precede or trail the moon in its orbit. And the one that you can't see there is L3, and that's on the opposite side of the Earth and is not particularly useful for anything very much. We also use them because they work between any two bodies of substantial size. So we also get them between the Sun and the Earth. In this case, you can see there the L2 position right out over here. And that is a very favorite place for putting space telescopes because it's sort of hidden from the Sun by the Earth quite a lot of the time. You put a satellite there, you can always communicate from the Earth to the space telescope because it will always be there. If you put it in orbit around the Sun, then eventually it would end up behind the Sun for a little while and you wouldn't be able to communicate to it. L1 is a very favorite place in this scheme for putting solar telescopes because again, they will sit there and watch the Sun. L4 and L5 are also used for solar telescopes because you can look at other aspects of the Sun. You can sort of look around the edge of it a little. And L3 we've not found a use for. It's completely on the opposite side of the Sun. So you can't communicate to it at all, basically, because you've got to go through the Sun to get to it. And although something will stay there, we haven't found a use for it yet. So back to the space age, and how are we doing on looking at what's on the moon? Well, we've got to start somewhere, and the very first probe was a Russian probe, Luna 1, 1959, dispatched by the Soviets, and was the first to approach the moon. It was intended actually to land on the moon, and when I say land, I mean crash, because that was the kind of the best you could do for your first attempt. You fire it off to the moon and hope you hit it. Well, it missed, but it did at least get very close to the moon. And so this is the first man-made object to get anywhere near the moon, Luna 1, 1959. It was intended to impact into the surface and take pictures as it went, but it didn't quite make it. However, Luna 2 did, very shortly after, again in 1959. This one did reach the moon. So this is the very first object, man-made, to reach the moon and send back pictures as it came in. Obviously, it didn't make it send back any pictures once it had crashed because it was all in bits at that point. So that's Luna 2, the first thing built by humans to land on the moon. And for land, let's go with crash. Luna 3, this was the very first time we actually got to see the far side of the moon. So for thousands of years, we'd looked at the moon and we'd known there was a far side of the moon because there must be. And this was the very first probe to actually go behind the moon and take any pictures. And there is one of its pictures. You can see it's very, very grainy. This was, many years before digital photography. So this was sort of wet film developed in chemicals, taken with a regular camera, and then scanned and sent back by sort of fax technology at the time. So extremely grainy, very poor resolution, but nonetheless a great achievement. We had finally seen behind the scenes of the moon. And as far as we could tell from this, it looked much like the rest of the moon. There wasn't anything particularly exciting there, no alien civilizations that we could see, but you could make up anything pretty much from that grainy image shown there. So the next big step forward really was Zond 3, another Russian probe. This one was designed to go to Mars and did in fact sort of go to Mars, but unfortunately they missed the window to send it to Mars and launched it sort of a month or two after when it was supposed to. And it eventually did get to Mars, except Mars wasn't there. So Mars would have been there if it launched on time, but it had moved around in its orbit by the time Zond 3 got there. So it was intended to go to Mars, and it sort of got to where Mars is, but as I say, Mars wasn't there. But on the way there, it did manage to take some pictures of the moon, including the far side, as it went past. So these were the first really detailed pictures of the moon that we got. So here we can see the cratered surface of the far side of the moon. And immediately you can sort of see there is some difference here. There are quite a lot of craters on there, but you can't really see the big seas that we see on the near side. So like the Sea of Tranquility and the Ocean of Storms and things like that, we can't see those big flat landscapes that we can normally see on the near side. You can, however, see conspiracy theories though, because due to sort of hiccups in the processing, there are a few anomalies in the photograph jumped on by conspiracy theories, and there is a big tower on the edge, perhaps used by aliens to spy on us. Who knows? The first thing to get to the far side of the moon was Ranger 4. This was one of the Ranger series. You might guess there's a Ranger 1, 2, and 3. This was the first of the US probes to enter the story. So Ranger 4 was destined to go to the far side and actually land on the far side, and yet again by land, I mean crash. And it was dispatched off, but it had a malfunction very quickly after it left orbit on the way to the far side. So as far as we know, this did get to the far side of the moon, but as we lost contact with it very soon after it left Earth's orbit, nobody quite knows what happens. And nobody knows quite what the result was. So maybe it got there, maybe it didn't, maybe it crashed, maybe it's still orbiting, who knows? We haven't found it since. Now, going back to the near side, we get to the first attempt to actually land safely on the moon. And this is Luna 9, yet another Russian probe. This is the first soft landing probe. So with rocket braking, it landed safely on the near side of the moon and started to do some science there. It had various instruments on board and was yet another step forward in the exploration of the moon. But again, the near side, this one, because let's do the easy stuff first. Luna 10, another Russian probe. This was the first lunar satellite. So this went into orbit and continually orbited the moon for a number of months, I believe, and did some important science at the time. It discovered mascons, if anybody knows what a mascon is, but which were important for the Apollo program. You can ask me about that at the end if you wish. Then we're getting nearer and nearer to the dream of getting men on the moon. From John F. Kennedy's speech in 1961, I think, that men on the moon by the end of the decade. 1969 is getting very close. So NASA sent a series of lunar orbiters, 1 to 5 here, that were intended to map the surface of the moon in high detail so that we could work out where to land on that. Obviously, they were kind of focusing on the near side, but because they were in orbit, taking many photographs, using spy satellite technology, actually. They did a comprehensive map of the moon, mapped about 96% of it, I believe, including the far side. And we can see here some very detailed pictures of the far side. And yet again, you can see it does look quite different to the near side. None of these big sea type areas, which aren't seas, obviously. But they did find some more conspiracies. So here's a tower and the shard, a big hawk type shaped thing that must be alien in nature. I don't know where it is because it's probably never been found since. Probably yet again another anomaly, but nothing like that to keep the dream alive that the aliens are watching us. Then we get back to yet more exploration. Zond 5. So you remember Zond 3 was the first one to take really good pictures of the far side. So Zond 5, yet another in the same series. This one, though, was quite a little bit more ambitious. It went round the moon. This one didn't go off to Mars. It went round the moon and came back and indeed landed back on Earth. So it went round to the far side of the moon. And this one had passengers. So this was the first living things to see the far side of the moon and get close up and personal with it. And it was 2 Siberian tortoises, some fruit flies, some mealworms, some plants and seeds. And this was a sort of an experimental thing to see, can living things continue to live in the vicinity of the moon in spacecraft. They were fairly sure, I think, at this point that there wouldn't be any hazards that would fry people who went to the far side of the moon, but it's all the better to have that proof. So these tortoises landed back safe and sound on the Earth, but a little bit hungry because they hadn't quite packed enough food, apparently. But good proof, if proof were needed, that you can get to the far side of the moon and survive. So yet another first for the Russians. So this is really the pinnacle of the space race. And up to now, the Russians are really winning hands down. So the Americans really have to do something very special at this point. And we all know what's going to happen, that they are going to land people on the moon. But just to sort of chart what's happened, the first satellite, Sputnik 1957, that Steve Tonkin was talking about yesterday, that he failed to see, I believe, but nonetheless, plagued by cloud. The very first thing that really woke up people to the space race. The first lunar probe, Luna 1, that we've talked about, and Luna 2, the first contact with the moon. The first spaceman, Vostok 1, we had Yuri Gagarin. So yet another first person into space. First space woman with Vostok 6 and in 1963 with Valentina Tereshkova. Yet another first with Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space in 1965 with Voskhod 2. First lunar soft landing, we've talked about Luna 9, and the first lunar satellite, Luna 10. So, practically everything space record going, the Russians are winning at this point. So it's quite a sort of sense of pride that needs to be regained by the Americans at this point in the space race. So we know what's coming. It's going to be the Apollo missions and the chance to get to the moon. Unfortunately, it does start with a terrible accident on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral with the Apollo 1 plugs out test. It wasn't called Apollo 1, it was retrospectively called Apollo 1. And these three, Grissom, Chaffee and White, were in the capsule undergoing a sort of routine test when some of the electrical cabling caused a spark, which started a fire. They were testing the capsule under a very high, under high pressure, pure oxygen atmosphere as one of the tests. And a lot of the things within the capsule that were sort of fire retardant turned out to be not fire retardant under pressurized pure oxygen. So the fire burnt through the capsule in just a few seconds and unfortunately killed these three astronauts. So something they had to pick themselves up from if they're January 1967, you can see there. So very close to the end of the decade already, and they're not even in space with the Apollo program at this point. There's a lot of predecessors, of course. A lot of these, all unmanned tests up to AS-204 Saturn 1B, which was the one where the disaster was. So they had tried out the Saturn program up to a certain point. Apollo 4 was the first Saturn V test, completely unmanned, as was Apollo 5 and Apollo 6. These are all unmanned tests to try things out. And it all came together with Apollo 7, the very first chance for NASA to see if this brand new Apollo spacecraft capable of taking people to the moon would work out and whether all the systems would work. So they launched Apollo 7, October 1968. It was a reasonably simple mission in that they just went into orbit around the Earth, but they did try out a few of the maneuvers. It was the first all-up test of the Apollo rocket, as I say, with people on board. So I guess quite a nail-biting time to see if this brand new rocket would perform successfully now with human cargo. Turned out it did. It performed pretty flawlessly, and they carried out all the tests, and then they splashed down and got on with things. So I've given this talk a few times now, and it still amazes me that the very next thing they do with this brand new rocket that they've tested out is send it to the moon. So Apollo 8, they say, right, we've had one successful test. Are we going to try it again? Or no, we'll go straight to the moon. So this is what they did. They launched into Earth's orbit, then fired the engine, took them out of Earth's orbit into lunar orbit. And the astronauts on board, these were the first people to directly see the far side of the moon with their own eyes. So they get to see the far side of the moon, and as far as I know, nobody came back and said it's full of aliens. But it did let them get a few interesting shots. So this is basically what they did. They went into orbit around the moon, got to see it, and then managed to fire the engine there and get back to the Earth, and successfully did that. On the way, taking this very iconic picture, the Earthrise picture of the Earth rising up as they came round the far side of the moon and seeing their home from space. Very popular picture of the time. This is the full details in case anybody wants to recreate it. So what else happened in the Apollo systems? Apollo 9 was another test. This time they took the lunar module up, went into Earth orbit, and they had to practice their extracting the lunar module from the rest of the rocket, docking with it and seeing if they could do all those systems. So they successfully did all those tests. So they now had all the bits that were required. Apollo 8 didn't have a lunar module. They just went around in the capsule. So Apollo 9 was a sort of double check out that they could do all the bits necessary to get a lunar module to the surface. Apollo 10 was a full dress rehearsal. They took a lunar module and 3 astronauts, went to the moon. The lunar module detached, went down very close to the surface of the moon before firing its engines, coming back up and redocking with the command module and returning. And luckily, the NASA had foreseen that the chances are that if you're getting that close to the moon and you're a gung-ho test pilot, you have to be careful that they don't go all the way and go and land on the moon and ruin the surprise of Apollo 11. So they didn't quite have enough fuel to do all those modules, do all those maneuvers rather, get actually to land on the moon. So Apollo 10 got very close, but didn't quite make it. Then Apollo 11, as we all know, did land successfully on the moon, and that story has all sorts of drama within it, but is better told in a different talk, I'm sure. There's lots of very good talks on that. So Apollo 11, and then we skip forward to the very last of the Apollo missions, Apollo 17. So this was the last Apollo mission. 18, 19, and 20 were originally planned, but very quickly got pruned off the schedule as the money started to dry up for the Apollo missions. So this was one that did take a geologist to the moon. So everybody else who'd been to the moon was effectively a test pilot or a pilot of some sort. But this time they took a geologist because a lot of the science was the geology of the moon. So, and Harrison Smith, the geologist, argued quite strongly that they should go for the far side of the moon, because we'd already seen the far side of the moon was quite different to the near side. So it'd be well worth exploring that and getting a few rock samples from there that could tell us a bit more about why the far side is so different to the near side. A mystery that to this day has not really been satisfactorily solved. Anyway, they didn't go to the far side, they went to the near side. I would imagine there was a bit of angst about going to the far side. That might have been pushing the envelope a little too far for NASA's final mission to the moon. There's all sorts of possibilities it could go wrong, so perhaps play it safe and go to the near side. And we got some good science out of that anyway. Meanwhile, the conspiracy theorists were back with a hollow moon this time. They decided that, well, maybe the aliens weren't swarming over the far side of the moon, but they could equally well be hiding within the moon. So the moon was now perhaps consigned to be a giant spaceship, and was just something that some other civilization had made and then parked there to watch us, and cunningly coated in rock and dust so that we would be none the wiser. This wasn't helped by the Apollo 12 mission, where once they'd returned to the command module with the lunar module, they discarded it whilst in lunar orbit and sent it off to impact into the moon because they didn't need it. And at least you know where it is if it's left making a crater on the moon. But they'd also put there a seismometer with certainly with Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 had both put there so they could monitor what happened when this lunar module crashed into the moon. And they said, quote, "The moon rang like a bell for over an hour." Well, something that rings like a bell has to be hollow. So this was kind of where some of the hollow moon concept came from. But they had a long history, actually. Edmund Halley proposed the Earth was hollow in 1692, based on a mistaken calculation by Isaac Newton. So that was sort of cleared up, although it did appear occasionally in fiction. H.G. Wells, with his science fiction story, The First Men in the Moon, he had people who went to the moon and then went inside it to meet the moon people who lived inside the moon. But in the 1970s, there was a journal article, well, it wasn't really a journal, but a report by 2 Russian scientists from the Russian Academy of Sciences. And they said that the moon is hollow and probably a spaceship. And this had a little bit of credence, given that they were both members of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and they had a sort of semi-convincing argument as to why it was. And other people had said maybe the moon of Mars, called Phobos, is also hollow. So there was quite a a lot of this stuff running around at the time. And even today, there are still people who think the moon is hollow and was built by a civilization. So you can buy this book on Amazon if you really wish to give these people more money. The Daily Mail is convinced, but I don't know that that's enough to convince the rest of us. Who knows? And of course, you know, we've since come across the iconic phrase that that's no moon. So maybe it is. We didn't do very much with the moon since the Apollo missions. There's been a few things sort of fly by it and a few minor missions that have gone past it. But the next really big thing was the LRO, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. So this is a high-resolution camera and mapping satellite that was launched to orbit the moon, went in 2009, and is still there mapping the moon. So it has two cameras, one with a 100-meter resolution, which you can get sort of the general picture of the moon, make very good moon maps for that. And it also has a high-resolution telephoto lens that can focus on objects down to about a ½ meter across. So for those people who say we've never been to the moon and it was all filmed by Stanley Kubrick on a soundstage in Los Angeles or something, well, it took pictures here of the Apollo 17 landing site. Of course, that's not going to convince good conspiracy theorists. These were also faked, as is the LRO and everything else. So you're never going to convince those sorts of people. But this is just showing the sort of detail you can get with this fine reconnaissance orbiter if you know where to look. You can't take the whole moon in ½ meter resolution. You'd be just too much data and too busy. But at least for Apollo 17, we can see where it landed and where they walked and where they parked the buggy and all that sort of stuff. So with that, we get our highest resolution picture of the far side, which is this one here, as you can see, and very heavily cratered, but not really with these seas that we see on the near side. A couple of flat spots, but not really quite somewhat different to the near side. And as I say, a mystery that still taunts us to this day. The only other significant thing that's happened to the far side is the Chinese mission Chang'e 4. They went to the moon. They went with Chang'e 3, that was to the near side, and landed the first soft landing for a long time on the near side of the moon, and took a rover with them that trundled around on the moon for a few days. Unfortunately, the rover failed after a few days because well, it has solar panels that sort of charge up and let it do its stuff during the 14 days of sunshine, and then you go into the 14 days of night of the moon, and it sort of shut down during that, and was then going to request a wake-up call for 14 days later, but it didn't really recover from that. That's the Chang'e 3. But the Chang'e 4, they went to the far side, and that was much more successful. And just a little bit about Chinese mythology, so that you understand some of these terms, and just because it's kind of interesting if you're bored with the science. So this comes from Chinese mythology. They see a rabbit in the moon, as you can see on the right-hand panel there. So where we see a man in the moon, they see a rabbit making potions with a mortar and pestle. So the story goes that in many years ago in ancient China, there was a terrible drought across all the land, and this was caused by 10 suns that appeared in the sky. I haven't worked out quite how 10 suns got there, but they had a way to work this out. So there was this terrible drought drying up all the land, and they sent this famous hunter called Yi with his bow and arrow, and he would go out there and shoot down 9 of the suns, which he duly did. And this saved the country from this terrible drought. The famine was avoided, and everybody was happy. And for his wonderful heroic efforts, he was given a potion made by this rabbit in the moon. Or it may have been a powder, I'm not sure, but something that he could consume. And this was it, and this would grant him immortal life. So if he drank this or chewed it or whatever you did, take the tablets, he would live forever. So this was Yi, and he wasn't quite sure whether he wanted to live forever because he just married this his wife called Chang Yi, and he wasn't sure whether living forever and watching his wife die was exactly what he wanted, or would it be better to live a full life with her or not? Anyway, he decided he'd think about it, put the potion on the shelf, and he'll come back to it. Sort of typical male thing, I think. So he put that on the shelf and went off and did, I don't know, whatever else he did, shooting more suns down or something like that. However, his understudy, or his I don't know what you call him, but anyway, Pang Meng, he wasn't quite so undecided about that. He decided, having heard this story, that he would very much like to live forever. So he broke into Yi's house and went to grab the potion and was going to live forever. But Chang Yi got there first, probably a bit of a tussle to get hold of it. She got it first and drank it down. So she got to live forever. And Pang Meng didn't, and neither did Yi. So the decision was taken out of his hands. One of the side effects, however, of living forever seems to be that you have to live on the moon. So she had to immediately go and live on the moon. And so they were separated, Yi on the Earth, Chang Yi on the moon. So unfortunately, these things never seem to end well. And the rabbit continued to make his potions on the moon. However, wasn't all bad, because the gods decided that having split them up, they would allow them to meet up once in a while. In fact, once a year, the magpies would fly up into the air and make a bridge that spanned from the Earth to the moon, and Chang Yi and Yi could cross the bridge and meet up and have one day a year that they could say hello to each other, or swap stories, or whatever you happen to do once a year with your husband and wife. And the rabbit on the moon continues to be the rabbit on the moon. So that's the story of that. Now you're fully up to date with that part. In fact, I've probably butchered the Chinese myth, so sorry if that is the case. But at least we now know some of the terminology. So Chang Yi was the lander that landed on the far side of the moon. There was a satellite in this L2 point, and this was called Kweo, which is the Magpie Bridge. So that's, you can see where this all fits into the Chinese folklore. This is the bridge between the Earth and the moon that lets Chang Yi and Yi communicate. And the little rover that Chang Yi 4 landed on the far side was called U2, which is the rabbit, the jade rabbit. Anyway, here it is. This is the rover just trundling off Chang Yi 4. And Chang Yi 4, you can see there, taken by the rover. And some pictures here from the Chinese Space Agency of what it got up to on the moon. So there it is, just got off the lander, trundling around on the moon. You can see its solar panels there. It has a drill here to drill down into the rock to take samples and analyze them. And there we can see some actual moving footage as it moves off from the rover. So this gives us our most complete picture of what we've done with the moon. So you can see there the Apollo landing sites, also Surveyor and Lunar Cod landing sites, also Chang Yi 3 up at the top there with U2 1, and Chang Yi 4 and U2 2 on the far side, emphasizing that actually China is the only nation to have successfully landed on the far side, if we discount Ranger 4, which may well be in bits on the far side. And it's done some good work, although not everybody believes it. So even today, the Daily Express is not entirely sure. But the LRO has taken images from orbit. So the LRO is still going strong, and there we can see Chang Yi 4 and U2 2 on the Earth's surface, on the moon surface, far side. And say it's done some really good science. There's a paper published in Nature, the most prestigious of the journals, trying to unravel quite why the far side is so different. And it's still going, actually. It's still trundling around. I've seen reports, certainly from Easter time and maybe after, that it is still trundling around. So it does its 14-day sprint and then shuts down or sleeps during the lunar night and then picks up and carries on. So you can see it's traveled quite a distance across the lunar surface. But it seems now that it's almost anybody's game is going to the moon, although not to the far side. So we've got Chandrayaan-4, Chandrayaan-2, the Indian mission that went to the moon, didn't quite make it. It failed at the last stage and rather than soft landing, crashed. Israel's Bereshit spacecraft also crashed on the moon. And there's a couple of animations there, which you probably can't see, but before and after impacts of the Vikram and the Bereshit landers. So with everybody sort of going to the moon, there's a question still to be answered, like, why is the far side of the moon so different? Why does it look so different to the familiar side of the moon? Is it because the Earth protects it from incoming cratering? No, it isn't. What we do know is that the far side is much thicker than the near side, but that doesn't really explain very much other than, well, it explains why there might be more volcanic stuff giving these lava flows on the near side, but then that just pushes the question back, why is the far side thicker than the near side? I have seen one or two papers on this, one or two discussions, but I don't think anybody is fully clued up on that. So good reason to go back to the moon for scientific purposes. Was it a home for aliens? Is it covered in aliens? Probably not. We've now got very good pictures of it through time. So what we're going to do with it in the future? Well, colonization would be my plan, and this is my personal opinion anyway. We'll have some very different ideas about it. So it's much easier place to get to than Mars. It's only 3 days away, whereas Mars is at least 9 months travel. So it's a really good place. You've got to solve a lot of the same problems if you get to Mars as on the moon. So you've got to protect yourself from radiation. You've got to make water, which there's quite a lot of water on the moon, but most of it is locked up in chemicals. So it needs some work to get it there. You've got to protect yourself from radiation, as I think I said. And you may find interesting things on the moon that would be resources that you could send back to Earth. And it's pretty easy to get stuff back from the moon to the Earth. If we look at this graph here, this is just the amount of energy you need to get stuff off the Earth in sort of arbitrary units. I think this is per kilogram or something like that. But you can see this big blue bar, that's the enormous amount of energy you need to launch something from the Earth into space. Compared to that tiny bit there for the moon, you need very, very little energy to launch something from the moon because it's such a much smaller body, and Mars is somewhere in between. So I'd say you need something about this size, a Saturn V rocket, to get from the Earth to the moon. You need only something this tiny, and you can see there an astronaut standing next to it, to get from the moon to the Earth. So getting back from the moon is really easy. Getting back from Mars is somewhat harder, but nowhere near as hard as getting from the Earth. So if we do find something worthwhile, something economic value on the moon, then it's pretty easy to get stuff back. And there've been quite a lot of science fiction stories about that. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is one of them by Robert Heinlein. But for astronomy, the moon would be perfect. The moon would be a fantastic place for telescopes for lots and lots of reasons. As I say, science fiction has been there before us. Arthur C. Clarke, a cracking good read, Earthlight, if you haven't read it. It's about a colony of astronomers and other people living on the moon, and all the big telescopes are now on the moon because it's such a perfect place to take pictures from. So I would selflessly volunteer to go up onto the moon and be an astronomer on the moon. I'd go there. So moon telescopes on the far side, it is perfect for lots of reasons. And you can see some of them there. No cell phones, no Starlink, no atmosphere, no light pollution, and no clouds. So it is perfect for all these possibilities. And indeed, the Royal Astronomical Society were just prior to lockdown, they were about to have a workshop on putting a radio telescope, I believe, in a crater on the far side of the moon. Would be a perfect place to put one. So with that, I don't know what your feelings are on living on the moon or putting things on the far side of the moon, but I think it would be the perfect place. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and hope you found some of that at least interesting or entertaining, or none of the above, in fact. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll now have a quick look at the chat and see if there are any questions that you need answering. But meanwhile, you can just raise your hands and or unmute yourself and see if there's anything come across in the chat.